What if the woman scrubbing your floors was smarter than everyone sitting in your boardroom? What if the person you look down on every single day, the one whose name you never bothered to learn, whose face you never really looked at, whose existence you barely acknowledged, was quietly, carefully, patiently building something that would one day make her more powerful than you could ever imagine? What if the maid you never once said good morning to ended up owning the very company you spent your entire life building? What if the invisible woman was never invisible at all? This is not a fairy tale. This is not a movie. This is not the kind of story people make up to make themselves feel better about the world. This is the true story of Grace Amara Williams, a woman who arrived in America with $40 in her pocket, a single worn suitcase held together with a leather strap, and a dream so enormous, so audacious, so completely unreasonable given her circumstances, that if she had ever dared to speak it out loud, the people around her would have laughed until they cried. They are not laughing anymore. Grace Amara Williams is worth $11 million today. She employs over 400 people across 7 cities. She has been featured in Forbes magazine, invited to speak at Harvard Business School, and recognized by the state of Texas as one of the most influential businesswomen of her generation. And it all started with a mop, a pale blue uniform, and a notebook that she carried everywhere she went. By the end of this story, you will never again look at the person cleaning your office, serving your food, washing your windows, or scrubbing your floors the same way again. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody is paying any attention to. Stay with me, because Grace's story is only just beginning. Grace Amara Williams was born on the 14th of February 1978, in Lagos, Nigeria. Valentine's Day. Her mother always said that was not a coincidence. That Grace had been born on the day the world celebrates love because she was going to spend her life doing something worth loving. She grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Lagos, not wealthy by any measure but stable, dignified. Her father, Emmanuel Williams, was a secondary school mathematics teacher who believed with every fiber of his being that education was the single most powerful force available to ordinary people in an unequal world. He said it so often that Grace and her 2 younger brothers, Kofi and Daniel, could recite it in their sleep. "Education is the one thing they cannot take from you," Emmanuel would say at the dinner table, tapping the wood with his finger for emphasis. "A man can lose his house, his money, his health. But what is in here?" And he would tap his temple. "That belongs to you forever." Grace took that seriously in a way that went beyond simply doing well in school. She was obsessed with understanding how things worked. Not just mathematics and science, though she was exceptional at both, but systems, processes, the way organizations function, the way money moved, the way some businesses thrived while others collapsed. By the time she was 16, she was reading her father's old economics textbooks for fun. By 18, she was borrowing business books from the local library and staying up until 2 in the morning reading about companies she had never heard of in countries she had never visited. Her teachers were unanimous. Grace Williams was going somewhere. They just had no idea how far. At 22, Grace graduated from the University of Lagos with a first-class degree in business administration. It was the proudest day of Emmanuel Williams' life. He sat in the front row of the graduation ceremony in his best suit, the dark blue one he only wore to church and important occasions, and when Grace walked across that stage to collect her certificate, he stood up. Nobody else was standing. He stood up anyway. Grace saw him from the stage. She almost lost her composure completely. Almost. She held it together, shook the dean's hand, accepted her certificate. And when she came down from that stage and walked to her father and he wrapped his arms around her, he whispered into her hair, "This is just the beginning, my Grace. This is only just the beginning." He had no idea how right he was. The year after graduation was supposed to be Grace's launching pad. She had plans. Detailed, carefully researched, notebook-filling plans. She wanted to start a business consultancy, helping small Nigerian businesses develop better systems and operations. She had already identified her first potential clients. She had a business plan that her favorite professor had called genuinely impressive. She was ready. And then her father collapsed at school on a Tuesday morning in October. It was his heart. The doctors at Lagos University Teaching Hospital were honest and grave. Amara Williams needed surgery. He needed medication that would have to continue for years. He needed monitoring and care that the family simply could not afford. Grace sat in that hospital corridor for 6 hours on the day of her father's diagnosis. She sat with her mother, Adiz, who was the strongest woman Grace had ever known, a woman who had built a successful fabric business from nothing, who had raised 3 children and run a household with the precision and warmth of someone who made it look effortless, and even Adiz's hands were shaking that day. Grace looked at her mother's shaking hands. And she made her decision. She went home. She opened her notebook. Not the business plan one, a different one. She turned to a clean page. At the top she wrote one word. America. The decision was not made lightly. Grace spent 3 weeks researching, calculating, planning. She had a distant cousin named Blessing who lived in Houston, Texas, and had been encouraging Grace to come for years. Blessing worked in a hospital as a nursing aide and said there was work, real work, consistent work, for someone willing to work hard. Grace called Blessing on a Sunday evening. "If I come," Grace said, "I need to know the truth, not the good version, the real version." Blessing was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It is hard, Grace. I will not lie to you. It is very hard. The work is not glamorous. People will not see you the way you deserve to be seen. You will work harder than you have ever worked in your life for money that will feel like nothing compared to what you are giving." He paused. "But it is real money. And you can send it home. And if you are smart, and you are the smartest person I know, you will not just survive there. You will build something." Grace closed her eyes. She thought about her father in his hospital bed. She thought about Kofi and Daniel, still in school, depending on a family income that was now devastated. She thought about her mother's shaking hands. "I am coming," Grace said. She told her parents on a Friday evening after dinner. Her mother did not cry. She stood up from the table, walked to the kitchen, and stood at the sink for a very long time with her back to the room. Her father reached across the table and took Grace's hand. "How much do you have?" he asked quietly. $40, Grace said. "And my savings from the part-time work. Enough for the ticket and a little extra." Emmanuel nodded slowly. "It is enough," he said. "It has to be enough." The morning Grace left for the airport, her mother was up before anyone else. She made Grace's favorite breakfast, jollof rice with fried plantain, at 6 in the morning, like it was the most normal thing in the world. They sat together at the kitchen table and ate in the kind of quiet that only exists between people who love each other so much that words feel inadequate. When it was time to go, Grace's mother held her face in both hands. She looked at her daughter for a very long time. Then she said, softly and absolutely clearly, "You are not going there to stay small. You hear me? You are going there to be great." Grace nodded. She could not speak. She picked up her suitcase. And she walked out of that door. And she did not look back. Because if she had looked back, she might never have left. Houston, Texas arrived like a physical shock. The heat, the size, the noise, the scale of everything, the highways that seemed to go on forever, the buildings that scraped the sky, the sheer overwhelming enormity of a city that did not know she existed and did not particularly care. Blessing's apartment was in a crowded neighborhood far from the gleaming downtown Grace had seen in photographs. 3 other Nigerian women already lived there: Amaka, Joy, and Folake. Grace made 4. She slept on a mattress on the living room floor, separated from the rest of the space by a curtain that Blessing had hung with careful, apologetic kindness. This was her beginning in America. 1 mattress, 1 curtain, 1 worn suitcase, and a business degree that felt, in that moment, about as useful as a chocolate teapot. She lay on that mattress on her very first night in Houston, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city outside, and she thought about her father's words. "What is in here belongs to you forever." She pressed her hand against her chest. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she thought, it begins. The cleaning agency was called Pristine Homes. A woman named Dolores ran it from a small office that smelled like bleach and old coffee. She was not unkind, simply efficient, in the way of someone who had processed hundreds of women exactly like Grace and had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. She looked at Grace's application. Looked at Grace. Looked back at the application. "Business degree," she said, in a tone that was not quite a question. "Yes," Grace said. Dolores nodded slowly. $9 an hour. Cash weekly. You supply your own transport. We provide the uniform." She pushed a pale blue shirt and dark trousers across the desk. "You start Monday." Grace took the uniform. She folded it carefully. She said thank you. And she walked out of that office with her head high and her jaw set and her heart doing something complicated that she refused to examine too closely. She had work. Real work. Money that could go home to her father. That was what mattered. That was all that mattered. Now, her first assignment was a house in River Oaks. Grace looked up River Oaks that night on the library computer. She read about it with the same focused attention she had given to her university textbooks. One of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the United States. Average home value in the millions. Home to oil executives, real estate developers, surgeons, lawyers, and the kind of old Houston money that had been accumulating for generations. She printed out the directions. She set her alarm for 5 a.m. And on Monday morning, Grace Amara Williams, business degree holder, strategic thinker, her father's brightest student, put on her pale blue uniform, picked up her cleaning supplies, and took the bus to River Oaks. She stood outside the house for a moment before ringing the bell. It was enormous. White columns. Manicured garden. A fountain in the driveway that was purely decorative. Grace thought about what Blessing had said. "People will not see you the way you deserve to be seen." She squared her shoulders. She rang the bell. And Patricia Caldwell opened the door. Patricia Caldwell was 52 years old, expensively dressed even at 8 in the morning, and had the energy of a woman who had never in her adult life been required to wait for anything. She looked Grace up and down in a single practiced sweep. "You're from the agency." It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Grace." "Kitchen first," Patricia said, already turning away. "Then the bathrooms. Floors last. No product residue on the marble. The last girl damaged an entire section and it cost me a fortune to repair. Do not touch anything in the study. And I prefer quiet while I work." She disappeared around the corner. Grace stood in the doorway. She thought about her mother's hands on her face. "You are not going there to stay small." Grace picked up her supplies. She walked into the kitchen. And she began. What Patricia Caldwell could not have known that morning was that the woman in the pale blue uniform was not simply cleaning her house. She was studying it. Every room. Every system. Every inefficiency and extravagance and wasted opportunity. Grace noticed that the Caldwell household employed 5 separate service companies: cleaning, landscaping, pool maintenance, grocery delivery, and errand services, each with their own billing, their own schedules, their own points of contact, and their own spectacular capacity for being unreliable. She noticed the waste, the disorganization, the money being spent for results that a single well-run operation could deliver better and cheaper. She filed every observation away. Because Grace Amara Williams had not come to America to clean houses forever. She had come to learn everything she needed to know. And the education she was receiving in River Oaks was more valuable than anything she had ever learned in a classroom. She just had to be patient. And Grace Williams had always been very, very patient. There is something that happens to a person when the world decides they do not matter. It is not dramatic. It does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, in 100 small moments that accumulate like drops of water filling a glass. The moment someone looks through you instead of at you. The moment your name is not remembered even though you have said it 3 times. The moment you are standing in a room full of people and you realize, with a certainty that settles into your bones, that not a single one of them sees you. Not really. Not as a person. Grace Amara Williams became invisible within her first week in River Oaks. And it was the best thing that ever happened to her. By the end of her first month in Houston, Grace had been assigned to 17 different households across River Oaks and the surrounding wealthy neighborhoods. 17 different houses. 17 different families. 17 different windows into the private, unfiltered, unglamorous reality of what it actually looked like to be rich in America. And what Grace saw was not what she expected. She had expected order, efficiency, the kind of crisp, well-organized lives that wealth was supposed to produce. What she found instead was chaos wearing expensive clothes. She found households where nobody talked to each other despite living under the same enormous roof. She found refrigerators stuffed with food that rotted untouched while the family ordered takeout every single night. She found schedules so fragmented and disorganized that the same family was paying 3 different people to do variations of the same task, and none of them were doing it particularly well. She found waste on a scale that made her physically uncomfortable. In one house, she found enough unopened food in the pantry to feed her entire family in Lagos for 6 months. The homeowner threw it away because the expiry dates were approaching. Grace cleaned that pantry without saying a word. But she never forgot what she saw. The invisibility had rules. Unspoken, unwritten, but absolutely clear. Do not make eye contact unless spoken to first. Do not offer opinions. Do not linger. Do not exist in a room any longer than the task requires. Grace followed every rule. And while she followed them, she watched. She watched the way Patricia Caldwell managed, or failed to manage, the 5 separate companies that serviced her household. She watched the frustration when the pool company came on the wrong day. She watched the phone calls made in irritated voices when the grocery delivery got the order wrong again. She watched the money spent and the results achieved and the enormous gap between the two. She watched in other houses too. Mrs. Henderson in Tanglewood, who spent $4,000 a month on household services and was perpetually dissatisfied with all of them. The Morrison family in Memorial, who had fired 3 cleaning companies in 1 year and still could not find anyone reliable. Dr. and Mrs. Park in West University, who were so busy with their medical practices that their household ran on organized chaos and prayers. Grace watched all of them. She said nothing. She smiled when smiled at. She answered when spoken to. She moved through those beautiful houses like a ghost, present but unnoticed, there but unseen. And every evening she went home to Blessing's apartment, sat at the small kitchen table, and opened her notebook. The notebook had started as a simple record-keeping tool. Hours work, money earned, money sent home. But within her first 2 months in Houston, it had become something else entirely. It had become a business plan. Not a vague, wishful, someday maybe plan. Real one. Specific. Detailed. Built on actual data collected from actual households by a woman with an actual business degree who had spent years studying exactly this kind of thing. Grace had identified a gap in the market that was so obvious, so glaringly apparent, that she could not understand why nobody had properly filled it. Wealthy households in Houston were spending enormous amounts of money on fragmented, poorly coordinated household services. They were dealing with multiple vendors, multiple invoices, multiple points of contact, and consistently unreliable results. What they needed, what they were clearly desperate for and willing to pay for, was one solution. One company, one contact, one invoice, premium, coordinated, reliable household management. Grace wrote the concept across the top of a fresh page in her notebook in capital letters. Harmony Home Services. She stared at it for a long time. Then she started writing the business plan beneath it. She wrote for 4 hours that night. She did not notice the time passing. The next 6 months were a study in discipline that Grace herself would later describe as the hardest period of her entire life. And that is saying something, given everything that came after. She was working 12-hour days on her feet, cleaning houses from 7 in the morning until 7 in the evening. She was sending a significant portion of every paycheck home to Lagos, where her father's medical bills continued to arrive with merciless regularity. She was surviving on less than 6 hours of sleep a night. And she was building a business plan with the hours that remained. There were nights when the exhaustion was so complete that Grace would sit down at the kitchen table, open her notebook, and find that she could not remember what she had been planning to write. Her mind was simply empty, scraped clean by the day. On those nights she did not fight it. She closed her notebook. She made herself a cup of tea. And she allowed herself to do one thing, just one thing before she went to sleep. She called home. Her father's voice on the phone was medicine. It was the one thing that could reach through the fog of exhaustion and remind her why she was doing this, why it mattered, why she could not stop. "How are you, my Grace?" he would ask. "I am well, Papa," she would say. Every time. Regardless of the truth. "Are you eating?" "Yes, Papa." "Are you being careful?" "Yes, Papa." And then sometimes on the nights when she needed it most, he would say, unprompted as if he somehow knew, "You are not there to stay small, my Grace. Remember that. You are not there to stay small." She would hang up the phone. She would open her notebook. And she would keep going. In her 8th month in Houston, Grace did something that terrified her more than anything she had ever done. She approached a client. Not Patricia Caldwell. Grace knew Patricia would not hear her, would not see her. Not yet. She chose instead a family called the Okafor Bennetts, a Nigerian-American couple, Dr. Chidi Okafor and his wife Rebecca, who lived in a large house in Sugar Land and had always treated Grace with basic human decency. They remembered her name. They said good morning. They asked occasionally how she was doing and actually waited for the answer. Grace arrived one Thursday morning for her regular cleaning appointment. When she finished, instead of leaving as usual, she knocked on the door of Dr. Okafor's home office. He looked up from his desk. "Grace, is everything all right?" She was holding her notebook. Her hands were not shaking. She had decided they would not shake. "Dr. Okafor," she said, "I have a proposal I would like to share with you. I believe I can save you money and significantly improve the management of your household services. I have put together a detailed plan. I am asking for 15 minutes of your time." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the notebook in her hands. Then he said, "Sit down, Grace." She presented for 22 minutes. Not 15. 22. Because once she started, the words came with a clarity and confidence that surprised even her. This woman who had spent 8 months being invisible, being quiet, being small. She was not small in that office. She was exactly who she had always been. Dr. Okafor asked 4 questions. Sharp, intelligent questions that told Grace he was genuinely engaged. She answered every one without hesitation. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he called out to his wife, "Rebecca, can you come in here, please?" Rebecca Okafor listened to Grace present for another 15 minutes. Then she looked at her husband. Then she looked at Grace. "When can you start?" she said. Grace's hands were shaking on the bus home. She allowed them to shake. She had her first client. Harmony Home Services, the company that existed only in a worn notebook and the mind of a woman who refused to stay small, had its very first client. She got home at 9:30 in the evening. Blessing was already asleep. Grace sat alone at the kitchen table. She opened her notebook to the page where she had written Harmony Home Services in capital letters 8 months earlier. Beneath it, in her small, careful handwriting, she wrote, "Client 1. Okafor Bennett Household. Sugar Land." She looked at those words for a very long time. Then she turned the page. And she kept writing. 3 weeks later, she had her second client. A family called the Washingtons. Longtime friends of the Okafor Bennetts who had heard about Grace through what Grace would later call the most valuable advertising in the world. Word of mouth from a satisfied client. Grace Amara Williams, who had arrived in America with $40, who slept on a mattress on a living room floor, who spent her days invisible in other people's houses, had 2 clients. She registered Harmony Home Services officially on a Tuesday evening at the public library. The registration fee was $45. Almost everything she had saved that month. She paid it without hesitation. She walked out of that library into the warm Houston evening. She stood on the pavement for a moment. And she allowed herself, just for that moment, just for those few seconds standing alone on a pavement outside a public library in a city that still did not know her name, to feel proud. Completely, deeply, fully proud. Then she straightened her shoulders. She started walking home. She had work to do. The first 2 years of Harmony Home Services were brutal in ways Grace had not fully prepared for. She had prepared for hard work. She had prepared for long hours and slow growth and the kind of exhaustion that settles permanently into your bones. What she had not prepared for was the disrespect. Not from her clients. The families who hired Harmony treated Grace well. That was partly why she had chosen them. The disrespect came from elsewhere. From vendors who did not return her calls promptly because they did not take her seriously. From suppliers who quoted her higher prices than they quoted others, until she caught them doing it and negotiated with a calm, steely precision that left them visibly uncomfortable. From people at networking events who heard household management services, and immediately looked past her for someone more interesting to talk to. From the bank manager who questioned her business plan with a skepticism that Grace was certain he did not apply to everyone who walked through his door. Grace absorbed all of it. She did not rage. She did not complain. She did not spend energy on bitterness that she needed for building. She simply noted it, filed it away, and used the anger as fuel, clean, efficient, sustainable fuel, that kept her engine running on the days when everything else threatened to run dry. By her third year, Harmony Home Services had 12 clients and 4 employees. Grace had moved out of Blessing's apartment into a small studio of her own. She had a proper desk, laptop, business phone. She was still cleaning houses herself 3 days a week, both because the business needed the income and because Grace believed deeply that a leader should never ask anyone to do something she was unwilling to do herself. But things were changing. She could feel it. The business had a reputation now. Small but solid. The kind of reputation built not on advertising or networking or luck, but on the single most powerful thing in any service business: consistent excellence. Grace's clients did not just stay. They referred. And their referrals referred. And slowly, steadily, with the same quiet, unstoppable patience that had carried Grace through everything else, Harmony Home Services grew. And then came Sandra Mitchell. The call came on a Wednesday evening while Grace was at her desk going through invoices. A woman named Sandra Mitchell, wife of David Mitchell, one of Houston's most prominent real estate developers, had heard about Harmony Home Services from a friend. She wanted to meet. Grace knew the Mitchell name. Everyone in Houston who paid attention to business knew the Mitchell name. She put down her pen. She sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up the phone and called Sandra Mitchell back. Her voice was completely steady. Inside, her heart was doing something she had not felt since the day she registered Harmony Home Services at the public library. Oh, real, enormous, terrifying hope. Grace put on her best outfit, a simple navy blazer bought second-hand from a thrift store in Midtown, pressed so carefully it looked brand new, and drove to the Mitchell house in River Oaks, the same neighborhood where she had scrubbed her first floor on her hands and knees 6 years earlier. She parked her second-hand Honda on the street. She sat in the car for exactly 60 seconds. She thought about her father, her mother, the $40, the mattress on the floor, the pale blue uniform, the notebook. Then she got out of the car. She walked up to the front door. She rang the bell. And when Sandra Mitchell opened the door and extended her hand with a warm, genuine smile and said, "You must be Grace. I have heard absolutely wonderful things about you." Grace shook her hand and walked through that front door. Not the back entrance. The front door. Like she had always belonged there. 'Cause she had. Sandra Mitchell was unlike anyone Grace had met in Houston. She was warm and direct and genuinely, deeply curious, the kind of person who asked questions because she actually wanted to know the answers. She had done her research on Harmony. She knew the client list, the growth trajectory, the reputation. And then she asked Grace the question that nobody, not one single person in 6 years, had ever asked her before. "What is your vision for this company, Grace? Not next month. Not next year. 5 years from now. What do you want Harmony to be?" The room was very quiet. Grace looked at Sandra Mitchell. And for the first time since she had left Lagos with $40 and a worn suitcase and a dream too big to say out loud, she said it out loud. "I want Harmony to be the largest premium household management company in Texas," Grace said. Her voice was clear and steady and completely certain. "I want to employ 200 people, the majority of them women, many of them immigrants. I want to change the way wealthy families think about household services entirely. And I want every single person who works for me to be paid fairly, treated with dignity, and given a genuine path to grow." Pause. "I want to build something that lasts." Sandra Mitchell looked at her for a long moment. A slow smile spread across her face. "Grace," she said quietly, "I think you might need an investor." Sandra Mitchell invested $250,000 in Harmony Home Services. Grace drove home from that meeting in complete silence. She did not turn on the radio. She did not call anyone. She parked outside her apartment building and sat in her car and looked at her hands on the steering wheel. $250,000. She thought about the $40 in her pocket at Houston Airport. She thought about the mattress behind the curtain. She thought about the pale blue uniform folded on Dolores's desk. She thought about her mother's hands on her face. You are not going there to stay small. Grace pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. And for the first time in a very, very long time, she let herself cry. Not from sadness. From something so much bigger than sadness that she did not have a word for it. She cried for exactly 4 minutes. Then she wiped her face. She went inside. She opened her notebook. And she started writing the next chapter. The 3 years that followed Sandra Mitchell's investment were the most intense of Grace's entire life. And that is saying something extraordinary. Because Grace's entire life had been intense. With $250,000 and Sandra's mentorship and connections, Harmony Home Services transformed in ways that even Grace's meticulous planning had not fully anticipated. She hired an operations manager, a sharp, experienced woman named Diane who had spent 15 years in hospitality management and brought a level of systems thinking that complemented Grace's vision perfectly. She hired a financial controller, client relations manager, a training coordinator. She built a headquarters, a real one, not a studio apartment desk. A proper office in Midtown Houston with a conference room and a reception area, and the name Harmony Home Services on the door in clean silver letters. Grace stood outside that door on the morning it was installed. She stood there for a long time. She thought about Dolores at Pristine Homes pushing a pale blue uniform across a desk. She thought about $9 an hour. She went inside. She had work to do. But the most important thing Grace built in those 3 years was not the office or the management team or the systems. It was the people. Grace had never forgotten what invisibility felt like. She had never forgotten the 1,000 small moments of being looked through, talked past, dismissed, and underestimated. And she was absolutely, uncompromisingly determined that no one who worked for Harmony Home Services would ever feel that way. She built training programs unlike anything that existed in the industry. Not just technical training, though that was rigorous and thorough. She built programs that taught communication, professionalism, financial literacy, how to open a bank account, how to build credit, how to save, how to plan. She created a promotion pathway, a clear, transparent, achievable route from entry-level positions to management roles. She paid above industry standard. Always. She knew what it cost a person to be underpaid for work that mattered. She had lived it. And she refused to pass that cost on to anyone who worked for her. Within 2 years of the investment, Harmony had 60 employees. Within 3 years, 140 premium clients and annual revenue of $3 million. Grace Amara Williams, who had arrived with $40 and slept behind a curtain, was a millionaire. She did not throw a party. She opened her notebook. She wrote the number down. She circled it once. And she turned the page. She had almost forgotten about Patricia Caldwell. Not entirely. Patricia was one of dozens of faces from those early invisible years, filed away in the back of Grace's memory alongside pale blue uniforms and marble floors and the smell of expensive cleaning products. But she had not thought about her in years. Until the Tuesday morning when Grace's assistant, her actual assistant, in her actual office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Houston, came in with an unusual message. A woman named Patricia Caldwell had called. She was looking for household management services. She had been referred by Sandra Mitchell. Grace's assistant waited for a response. Grace was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Outside her office window, Houston stretched out in every direction, a city that had not known her name when she arrived and now knew it very well indeed. She thought about a cold River Oaks morning 12 years earlier. Pale blue uniform. A door that opened before she had finished saying her own name. Kitchen first. Floors last. I prefer quiet. Grace looked at her assistant. Schedule the meeting, she said. Patricia Caldwell walked into Grace's office on a Thursday morning. She was older, thinner. Something about her had changed in a way that went beyond age. A softness where there had once been sharp edges, a quietness where there had once been brisk efficiency. Grace would learn later that Patricia's husband had left her 3 years earlier. That the River Oaks house, the one with the marble floors and the fountain in the driveway, had been sold. That Patricia was rebuilding her life in a smaller home with a smaller budget and a very different understanding of what mattered. Patricia sat down across from Grace's desk. She looked at Grace with polite, professional attention. She was doing what people do in business meetings, assessing, evaluating, forming first impressions. And then something shifted. A flicker crossed her face. She looked at Grace more carefully. The way you look at someone when a memory is trying to surface but has not quite made it yet. Have we? She began slowly. Yes, Grace said. Simply. Clearly. Without drama. I cleaned your house. Every Thursday morning. For almost 2 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia's face went through something complicated and private. She looked down at her hands. When she looked up again, her eyes were different. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. Grace said nothing. You were always professional, Patricia continued, her voice careful and deliberate, like someone choosing each word with unusual care. Always excellent. You never gave me a single reason to treat you the way I did. And You stop. I never treated you like a person. And I am deeply sorry for that. The office was very quiet. Grace looked at this woman, older, softer, smaller in some fundamental way, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something much quieter than either of those things. Something that felt, unexpectedly, almost like peace. Thank you, Grace said. For saying that. She meant it completely. She opened her notebook. Now, she said, in the same clear, steady voice she had used in Dr. Okafor's home office 12 years earlier, let me tell you what Harmony Home Services can do for you. Grace took Patricia Caldwell as a client. There were people in Grace's life who questioned this decision when they heard about it. Blessing raised an eyebrow over the phone from her new apartment in Atlanta. Even Sandra Mitchell asked gently if Grace was certain. Grace was certain. She had not built Harmony Home Services on bitterness. She had not survived 15 years in America on resentment. She had not become who she was by carrying the weight of every person who had ever dismissed her, or looked through her, or failed to say good morning. She had built everything she had on something much more powerful than any of that. She had built it on the belief that every person, every single person without exception, deserved to be treated with dignity. That belief did not have a list of exceptions. It did not have a clause that said except for the people who once treated you badly. Grace served Patricia Caldwell with the same excellence she brought to every client. And in doing so, she did not just take the higher road. She reminded herself, and everyone watching, exactly who Grace Amara Williams had always been. There is a moment in every great story when everything the person has sacrificed, everything they have endured, everything they have refused to give up on, finally, completely, undeniably pays off. For Grace Amara Williams, that moment did not arrive in a single dramatic instant. It arrived the way the most meaningful things in life always arrive. Slowly, quietly, and then all at once. Today, Harmony Home Services operates in 7 cities. Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, New Orleans, Baton Rouge. Memphis, 412 employees. The majority of them women. A significant number of them immigrants. Every single one of them paid above industry standard, given a clear promotion pathway, and treated. Grace checked on this personally and regularly, with dignity. Annual revenue of $11 million. Grace Amara Williams, who arrived in America with $40 in her pocket and slept on a mattress behind a curtain in a crowded apartment, built an $11 million company. With a notebook, pen, and a refusal to stay small. The Forbes feature came out on a Tuesday morning. Grace's assistant sent her the link at 7 a.m. with 3 exclamation points, which was extremely out of character and made Grace smile. She read the article at her desk with a cup of tea. They had gotten most of it right. The immigrant story. The cleaning company beginning. The Sandra Mitchell investment. The growth. What they had not fully captured. What Grace thought could never quite be captured in an article, was what it had actually felt like. The mattress on the floor. The pale blue uniform. The notebook at the kitchen table at midnight when every muscle in her body was screaming for sleep, and she wrote anyway. The phone calls home to her father's voice. The invisibility. The watching. Patience. The relentless, grinding, beautiful, terrible work. Forbes could give you the numbers. Could not give you the weight of them. The Harvard invitation arrived 6 months after the Forbes article. Grace read the letter 3 times. Then she called her mother. Amara Williams, the woman who had built a fabric business from nothing, who had held her daughter's face in her hands at a Lagos airport and sent her into the world with 6 words that changed everything. Listened to Grace read the letter aloud. When Grace finished, there was silence on the line. Then her mother said very softly, "Read it again." Grace read it again. Another silence. "My daughter," Amara said finally. "My daughter is going to Harvard." She said it the way you say something that you have to hear out loud to believe. Grace pressed her hand over her mouth. She was not going to cry. She absolutely cried. She flew to Boston first class. She had debated this. The practical, careful part of her that had calculated every dollar for 15 years instinctively reached for economy. But Sandra Mitchell, who had become one of Grace's closest friends over the years, had called her the week before and said simply, "Grace, you are going to Harvard to speak. You are flying first class. This is not a discussion." Grace flew first class. She sat in that wide, comfortable seat somewhere over the middle of America and looked out the window at the clouds below and thought about a different flight. A much longer one years earlier from Lagos to Houston in the very last row of economy, with $40 in her pocket and a suitcase held together with a leather strap. She thought about the woman she had been on that flight. Terrified. Determined. Alone. She thought about everything that woman had survived to get to this seat, this flight, this destination. She ordered a glass of water. She raised it very slightly. Private toast. To that woman. To all the floors she had scrubbed and the notebooks she had filled and the nights she had refused to stop. She drank it. And she looked back out at the clouds. She stood at the Harvard podium on a bright October morning. The auditorium was full. Faculty, students, business leaders. People who had read about her in Forbes and wanted to see her in person. Grace looked out at all of them. She had prepared a polished professional presentation. Slide. Data. A carefully structured narrative about entrepreneurship and market gaps and scaling a service business. She looked at her notes. She looked at the audience. She closed the folder. And she told the truth. She told them about the $40. About Blessing's apartment. About the mattress behind the curtain. She told them about Dolores pushing a pale blue uniform across a desk. She told them about River Oaks. About marble floors. About becoming invisible. She told them about the notebook. About the kitchen table at midnight. About her father's voice on the phone. About the Okafor Bennetts and the $45 registration fee that was almost everything she had. About Sandra Mitchell asking the question nobody else had ever asked. About Patricia Caldwell walking into her office. She told them everything. And when she finished, the auditorium was completely silent for a moment that lasted just long enough to feel significant. Then it erupted. Grace stood at that podium while Harvard gave her a standing ovation. She did not look at the ceiling the way Noah Harrison used to when he was trying not to cry. She looked straight ahead. And she let every single second of it wash over her. Her father came to Houston the following spring. Amara Williams, 71 years old, recovered, retired, still the proudest man Grace had ever known, flew to America for the first time in his life. Grace picked him up from the airport herself. She did not send a driver. She went herself. She stood at arrivals and watched the doors, and when her father came through them, older, slower, but with those same eyes that had always seen her more clearly than anyone, she walked to him and held him for a long time without saying anything. He smelled like home. Like Lagos and mathematics textbooks and Sunday dinners and everything she had left behind to become who she was. "Papa," she said finally. "My Grace," he said. That was all. That was everything. She took him to the office. Rode up with him in the elevator to the 14th floor. Walked him to the window that looked out over Houston, this enormous, indifferent, magnificent city that had not known her name when she arrived and now knew it very well. Amara Williams stood at that window for a long time. He looked at the city spread out below. He looked at the name on the office door. Harmony Home Services. He looked at his daughter. And his face did something that Grace had only seen it do twice before. At her university graduation, and at her mother's fabric stall on the day the business turned its first real profit. It broke open with pride so complete and so pure that it had nowhere to go but his eyes. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Education is the one thing they cannot take from you." Grace smiled. "What is in here?" she said, tapping her temple, exactly the way he had always done at the dinner table. "Belongs to you forever." Her father laughed. Real laugh. Full and warm and completely delighted. He put his arm around her shoulders. And they stood together at that window, father and daughter, looking out over the city that had tried to make her invisible and failed completely. Grace still has the notebook. The original one. First one. The one that started as a record of hours worked and money sent home and became, page by page, midnight by midnight, refusal by refusal, the blueprint for everything she built. The cover is held together with tape now. The pages are soft with age and handling. Some of the early entries are smudged where tired hands rested on wet ink. Sits on her desk. Not in a frame. Not under glass. Just there. Ordinary. Available. Real. Her staff ask about it sometimes. The new ones who have heard the story but have not quite internalized it yet. They ask why she keeps something so old and worn on her desk instead of something more impressive. Grace always gives the same answer. Because I never want to forget where I started. And I never want anyone who works here to think that where they start is where they have to stay. Grace Amara Williams arrived in America with $40. She scrubbed floors that were not hers. She moved through rooms where nobody saw her. She sat at a kitchen table at midnight, alone, exhausted, and she wrote. And wrote. And wrote. She built something from nothing. Not because it was easy, not because the world made space for her, not because anyone handed her anything. But because she refused. Refused to stay small. Refused to be defined by what others saw when they looked at her. Refused to let the weight of everything that was hard crush the dream of everything that was possible. And today, in 7 cities with 412 employees, with a notebook on her desk and her father's words in her heart, Grace Amara Williams is exactly who her mother always knew she would be. She is great. She was always going to be great. The only question was how long the world would take to notice. Right now, somewhere in this world, there is a woman like Grace. She is cleaning a house that is not hers. She is serving food in a restaurant where nobody knows her name. She is sitting on a bus at 6 in the morning on her way to a job that does not see her. And in her bag, or in her head, or in the quiet hours after midnight when everyone else is asleep, she has a plan. Do not underestimate her. Do not look through her. Do not mistake her silence for emptiness, or her patience for acceptance, or her invisibility for absence. 'Cause she is watching. She is learning. She is writing. And one day, one ordinary, extraordinary day, she is going to walk through that front door. And she is going to change everything.